Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. As Vladimir Putin continues his war on Ukraine, we learn about the country through the works of its authors and poets. For years, Ukraine fought to preserve its culture, its literary works and language from imperialism. Coming up, we talk about influential writers from Ukraine and how the history of its people shaped contemporary literature too. And we learn why there's a new urgency translating Ukrainian writing into English. Do you have a favorite Ukrainian writer or poet to recommend? You can join us. 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. You can share a comment on our Facebook page or find us on Twitter at Where We Live. Joining us first is a writer, Askold Melnyczuk, who's a professor at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. His latest work is a collection of stories called The Man Who Would Not Bow. He's also co-editor of From Three Worlds, an anthology of Ukrainian writers. Askold Melnyczuk, welcome to our show.
Morning, Lucy. Thank you so much for having me, although I'm sorry that these are the circumstances under which we meet.
We're going to have a really interesting conversation because you are a writer, but I wanted to learn a little bit about your personal story, Askold. And I understand your parents are Ukrainian refugees, so tell us about how they ended up in the United States.
Sure. So my mother's family is from Przemyśl, Poland. They're part of a Ukrainian community that lived there. My grandfather was a high school teacher. My mother was going to university in Lviv when the Second World War broke out. Her mother fell ill. My mother returned from Lviv to Przemyśl to help take care of her mother and her younger brothers and sisters, while my grandfather tried to keep things going. The school, as the war progressed and the Germans moved in and began the Holocaust, began to liquidate the ghetto, Jewish couple, students of my grandfather's wound up arriving on their doorstep one night, having dropped off a wagon load of corpses that was being driven out of the ghetto, and they asked for shelter there. My grandfather took them in. My uncle spent the night building a room in the pantry for them, and they wound up living there for the next 9 months. Circumstances were especially tense and dramatic, in part because they lived right across from the police station in the city. As when the Soviet army arrived in 1944, my grandfather learned that he was on a hit list, and he had already put his family at enough risk. This included a 7-year-old daughter, my aunt, and he decided that it was time to leave the city, something he desperately did not want to do because he was very committed to its civic life. He had founded a museum and a men's choir and that sort of thing. But leave they did. In fact, they left the couple in their apartment, and the couple, the Schefflers, made it out safely and wound up immigrating to Palestine, Israel, and the family stayed in touch after the war. My grandfather and his children and my father, who was from another part of the country and had been staying with my grandfather as he was falling in love with my mother, they wound up in a displaced persons camp, as they called refugee camps in those days, in Berchtesgaden, Germany. And they spent the next 5 years in those refugee camps while they were vetted and awaiting a sponsor in the United States. They were also applying for sponsorship in Canada and Australia, and eventually they found someone to sponsor them here. You needed to have somebody who said they would help you reestablish your life here before you were able to get a visa to come here. And they finally arrived in the United States in 1950. My father and mother had meanwhile married while they were in the refugee camp. And I was born 4 years after their arrival in New Jersey. So that's the sort of story of their journey here. But the other sort of element that two things I want to stress about that story. One was that they hadn't wanted to leave. They weren't immigrants, they were refugees. They were committed to trying to stay in their country, to build it and help rebuild it. They expected that the communist regime would collapse relatively soon after they had arrived and they would be able to go back. That did not happen. Another sort of lesson that sort of stayed with me from their story was their opening their house to the couple from the ghetto, the Schefflers, who had been seeking refuge. As they gave refuge to that couple, so they were given refuge here in this country, and that was something for which they and I have always been grateful.
When I was driving into work today, I think the number now are 3 million people have fled Ukraine, refugees like your relatives once were. This must be a difficult time for you when you think about what's happening to Ukraine today.
It's shocking. It's so utterly unexpected. The country had been developing into what we would call a normal country over the last 30 years, ever since it had achieved independence. And it feels now like I will spend the rest of my life helping to rescue my own parents.
Oh, we wanted to talk with you about the role of literature in Ukrainian identity and culture, its language. So while you were growing up, what drew you to literature? Who do you remember learning about?
My mother had wanted to be a poet, and reading was reading fine literature, reading poetry, reading novels was a kind of given in our house. My mother read to us as when we were little kids and encouraged us to memorize poems. Memorizing poems was also a kind of commonplace practice in Ukrainian households. And that really is because of this singular figure in Ukrainian literature. I'm thinking of this fantastic figure of Taras Shevchenko, who was a poet and a painter. He'd been born a serf, but his master, his owner, had recognized that he was a talented draftsman, and so had sent him to art school in St. Petersburg. And there, a number of other established artists and friends recognized his gift and bought his freedom by auctioning off a painting of the Tsar, as I recall. And he went on to become the most important figure in Ukrainian literature and perhaps in Ukrainian statehood. I can't think of a comparable figure in any other world literature because Shevchenko was a kind of hybrid of Frederick Douglass, Walt Whitman, and Abraham Lincoln. His poems told the story of the suffering of the serfs, who were essentially slaves, for the first time written in the vernacular, written in the language that people spoke, not in the kind of formal and official language of empire, which was Russian, as all sort of publishing and literary work was controlled by the empire. His words gave meaning and dignity to the people suffering and articulated their longing for justice. People all over the country began to memorize those poems, and that tradition of learning his and studying his poetry has been passed on across generations, so that we celebrate his birthday. In fact, it passed just a few days ago. He was born on March 9th in 1814 and died on March 10th in 1861, the age of 47, having spent a good part of his life in the Russian gulags as an exile and imprisoned for writing on behalf of the freedom of the people. And he died just as serfdom, aka slavery, was being abolished in Ukraine. So he was sort of the foundation, and from him grew a number of other important poets, ranging from Ivan Franko and the playwright and novelist Lesya Ukrainka, also a seminal figure through poets in the 20s and 30s, like Mykola Zerov and Yevhen Pluzhnik, to all the way to contemporary times. Literature has always been a way in which people have had their lives witnessed and their experience reflected on, and it has mattered and continued to matter. There's more. The whole sort of history of the evolution of the literature is tragic, in part because the efforts of the Russian Empire to restrict Ukrainian self-awareness involved a censoring of work written in that language. This led to something called the what I call the aborted Renaissance. Shortly after Ukrainian independence in 1919, which lasted only a few months, there was a kind of flowering of Ukrainian literature again, and that flowering was cut short under Stalin's time. Just to give you one sort of fact there, in 1930, there were something like 260 writers active in the country's literary life. By 1938, only 36 of them remained on the scene. 220 of the 224 that were missing, 17 had been shot, 8 had committed suicide, 175 had been arrested or interred, 16 disappeared without a trace, and only 7 died of natural causes. So that there's always been a concerted assault on the literature as part of an effort to erase national consciousness and self-awareness.
You're hearing on Zoom with us Askold Melnyczuk, a professor at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. His latest work is a collection of stories called The Man Who Would Not Bow. He's co-editor of From Three Worlds, an anthology of Ukrainian writers, as we talk about the role of Ukrainian literature today as the world watches, as this country is continually being attacked by Vladimir Putin. When we talk about the history that you recited, the fact that the legacy of poets like Shevchenko, and when you think about your ancestry, how did that influence your writing, Askold?
It's a complicated story, in part because while when I was a child, I read and dutifully memorized hundreds of lines of some of the poets whose work I've mentioned, and in fact would recite them publicly at various venues on special holidays and special occasions, a practice that will be familiar to many of your Ukrainian listeners. As I grew older, I began to recognize that the literature that I had been reading, as encouraged by my parents, was reflecting a life in a world that did not actually jibe with what I was seeing around me growing up in suburban New Jersey, 20 miles outside of New York City. And so, I felt a tension between what I was kind of rehearsing publicly and formally and what I was experiencing. So that as I began to write myself, I felt divided about how to approach what a writer's mission was, because the Ukrainian literature on which I had been weaned was so much in opposition to a very kind of particular world and set of circumstances. I did not feel that was, quite what I was encountering and writing about. As a result, sort of my early stories were more influenced by writers whose world was closer to Connecticut suburbs. I mean, writers like John O'Hara or John Cheever. And I was trying to avoid the material that was my inheritance, which felt at the time like a burden I was not ready to tackle because the history was tangled. Because at the time, Ukraine was a kind of terra incognita, an unknown country, a country that people did not quite believe existed and did not want to credit as existing. And so for a long time, I wrote stories in which my characters were nameless, and the stories took place in nondescript geographical settings without any history, or they took place among Wall Street brokers who wound up rushing off to their homes in Connecticut, again, worlds about which I knew nothing. Eventually, I was able to break through that block and begin to try to address the particular reality that was my own legacy. And at that point, I wrote my first novel, What Is Told, in which I was able to synthesize something of the history that I had heard about, and in a way let others know about it, even as it was met by a certain amount of resistance and skepticism.
Mm. Coming up, we're going to hear Askold read from one of his latest works. But our listeners should know that you also work as a translator and an editor, bringing Ukrainian literature to the English-speaking world. Since the war broke out, there has been a push to get more Ukrainian to English translators. The New York Times reporting recently, it started with a request from the associate director at the Tompkins Agency for Ukrainian Literature and Translation, who wanted to highlight Ukraine's distinct literary and linguistic heritage. Can you talk about this request and how the literary world responded?
Yes, gladly. Yes, so Zhenya Tompkins' important work as a kind of clearinghouse that brings together Ukrainian writers and translators is a kind of profound project, incredibly timely, and she was really well positioned to help with this process of transition. In part, again, Ukrainian literature has long been overshadowed by Russian literature and the sort of incomprehension of an understandable incomprehension of readers and our audience, in our Anglophone audience here, was a roadblock to getting word out about it. And the urgency of the moment has happily opened some of those doors. I became involved with the kind of contemporary literary scene most directly in 1990, when I had received an invitation to come to Kyiv for a poetry conference. In 1990, the Soviet Union still stood, and I had second thoughts about going, but then, of course, I decided to go, and was the people I met in Kyiv in 1990 became lifelong friends. I'll never forget sitting in an auditorium in that city, listening to a young writer by the name of Oksana Zabushko. She had just published her first book. There were like 25 or so of us from outside Ukraine who were either Ukrainian-born writers of an older generation, or like myself, children of Ukrainian refugees who were already known as writers in this country, who'd been invited to kind of meet their counterparts in Kyiv. And so anyway, we were all asked to say a few words about why we were here and what we were hoping to see. And meanwhile, the Ukrainian writers told us what they wanted to say to us. And this young, fiery young woman, 28 or 29 years old, stood in front of the room and scolded us, saying that if we thought we knew something about their experience, we should think twice, because we who either had left or were the children of those who had left had no idea of what they had experienced over the last half century, since my parents had gone, in trying to establish their own sort of individual identity and claim to freedoms. Because after all, writers remained repressed in Ukraine until Gorbachev and Perestroika in the late 80s, early 90s. And the last writer to die in a Soviet prison camp was a poet named Vasil Stus, who died in 1985 at the age of 47, coincidentally the same age that Taras Shevchenko was when he died. Anyway, Oksana just scolded us and insisted that we open our eyes to their lives. After that experience, I kind of came home deeply moved and committed to making sure that those unheard voices found an audience here. I was able, through literary friends and connections in Boston, to pull together this anthology from three worlds that brought to American awareness the really lively and exuberant work of the latest generation of Ukrainian writers most of whom have gone on to remain important figures in the culture today, particularly Oksana Zabushko.
Mm. I'm glad you brought her up because when you talk about her being fiery, the address that she gave before the European Union, the European Parliament, I believe on International Women's Day, chastising the world for ignoring what has been happening in Ukraine since 2014 and the fact that the spirit won't stop Putin's bombs. Could you read one of Oksana Zabushko's works for us?
Absolutely, with pleasure. This is a poem titled A Definition of Poetry. And the translation is by Michael Naidan and myself. A definition of poetry. I know I'll die a difficult death. Like anyone who loves the precise music of her own body, who knows how to force it through the gaps in fear as through a needle's eye, who has danced a lifetime with the body, every move of shoulders, back, and thighs shimmering with mystery like a Sanskrit word, muscles playing under the skin like fish in a nocturnal pool. Thank you, Lord, for giving us bodies. When I die, tell the carpenters to take down the rafters and ceiling. They say my great-grandfather, a sorcerer, got out this way. When my body softens with moisture, the bloated soul, dark and bulging, will strain like a blue vein in a boiled egg white, and the body will ripple with spasms like the blanket a sick man wrestles off because it's hot, and the soul will rise to break through the press of flesh, curse of gravity. The cosmos above the black well of the room will suck on its galactic tube, heaven breaking in a blistering starfall, and draw the soul up, trembling like a sheet of paper. My young soul, the color of wet grass, to freedom. Then, stop, it screams, escaping on the borderline between two worlds. Stop, wait, my God, at last. Look. Here's where poetry comes from. Fingers twitching for the ballpoint, growing cold, becoming not mine.
Mm. You're hearing Askold Melnyczuk here on Where We Live as we talk about Ukrainian writers today. He's reading a poem by a very famous poet in Ukraine, Oksana. Say her last name again for me, Askold.
Zabushko.
Zabushko. When I was thinking about what it must be like for Ukrainian writers who are still in Ukraine today, what are you hearing from people within your circle?
Yeah, Lucy, it's a for me a very unnerving story. I'm in regular touch with a number of writers there. We check in the mornings, and I'm working with a number of human rights groups in possibly looking for places to house writers who become refugees. However, what I'm hearing from all of them is that they are refusing to leave, and this is making me incredibly anxious. While a number of them have left Kyiv and gone further west to places like cities like Lviv, they are still refusing to become part of the refugee movement. They are determined to stay and to fight. What's so shocking is speaking to the young writers who I knew primarily as poets writing about more traditional themes, about love, about kind of growing up, about the struggles of daily life. They're suddenly becoming war poets. They're becoming, their verse is becoming martial, angry, and all too similar to the work of their ancestors, the kind of work that I and they had hoped had Ukrainian literature had been done with for 30 years, it appeared that they had been done with having to respond to extremes of violence and oppression and silencing and censorship. And I think it's precisely, however, that it's precisely because they have sort of in their bones an awareness of what can happen should they surrender once more to Russian domination. They would wind up living in an oppressive and authoritarian culture that would not allow them to speak freely. They have for 30 years been breathing freely, been able to speak their minds, been able to criticize their government, as is possible in a democracy and impossible in an authoritarian, in a dictatorship such as the one that Putin has established in Russia. And I think that they have decided that they would rather fight and die than have to live in that atmosphere again. So what I'm hearing is that they're staying put, and the men who are between the ages of 18 and 60 are either being armed or they are working as first aid workers. In fact, I remember about a month ago, before the start of the war, as the tensions were ramping up, I would be getting emails from writers in Ukraine saying that they are now being offered training in first aid in case an attack began, so that they were beginning to anticipate and prepare in, again, ways that are pretty inconceivable, certainly to me, and I would say to most of us here in this country. They've been forced with their backs against the wall to stand up and resist, and they are resisting.
We need to take a quick break. My guest again is Askold Melnyczuk, professor at University of Massachusetts, Boston, as we talk about Ukrainian literature today, about Ukrainian writers around the globe, and those, as Askold mentioned, that are still in Ukraine. PEN America had an online conversation in early March and included writers in Ukraine. One writer and translator shared, "The topic of our lives now is only war. Writing is on hold. I am only a man trying to survive, and I haven't any words to describe this experience, this Russian cruelty." More after a short break. You're listening to Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today we're talking about Ukrainian literature with my guest, who is a writer himself, Askold Melnyczuk, professor at University of Massachusetts, Boston. His latest work is a collection of stories called The Man Who Would Not Bow. Askold, when we think about after Ukraine gained its independence in 1991, how did literature change? And were writers able to explore banned topics?
Yeah, great question. In fact, they were. It was, again, a slow process. One of their leading literary critics, a brilliant young woman named Solomia Pavlichko, who became a friend and actually wound up spending some time teaching at Yale and at Harvard, wrote the introduction to the first sort of anthology of the literature written by the writers who were in their 20s when the country declared its independence. They had to do a number of things. On the one hand, for the first time, it was possible for them to meet with writers from the West. And one of the things that writers from the West brought them was news of their own story, which was something of a shock to them, in part because the history of the previous 50 years had been censored. It was not something found in any textbooks. You just mentioned the Holodomor, and the Holodomor was the artificial famine Stalin created in 1932, between 1932 and 1933, in order to break the resistance of Ukrainian peasant farmers who were unwilling to be forced into communes. And as a result, Stalin had all the sort of wheat and food that they had grown taken from the villages, from the people, and sold abroad, brought back to Russia. Meanwhile, the people who had grown the wheat, the people who had worked on the farms themselves began to starve. They starved by the millions. The final total of the dead between 1932 and 1934 is something between 3 and 5 million people. In fact, that's been brilliantly documented by the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Anne Applebaum in a book called Red Famine. So many of the younger writers' parents had experienced, and grandparents had experienced this famine, but had really been unable to talk about what they had seen. I mean, the things they had witnessed were beyond speaking. They had witnessed cannibalism. They had witnessed body parts sold in the marketplace. There are stories of certain families drawing straws to decide which member of the family was weak enough to become the victim who would sustain the rest of the family. These kinds of stories obviously were suppressed by the people who had somehow managed to survive it, and the stories were only beginning to be unearthed after Ukraine gained its independence. As people learned about their own history and their own sort of family stories and personal stories, there was first a sense of shock, a sense of a need to begin to come to terms with something that they had not known about. In a lot of ways, it's perhaps, I don't know that it's any more an extreme an example of this country is coming face to face with its own history of racism. Any kind of suppressed history eventually rises up. That was the first thing the writers needed to deal with. At the same time, they, in part because they were free for the first time to encounter living writers from the West, they began to discover new ways of telling. They began to discover modernism and then postmodernism. So all kinds of formal experiments were being conducted in literature. Instead of having to write stories that were sort of prescribed by the government, they were free to tell the stories, personal stories about their own lives. There's actually a memorable line in Dr. Zhivago, in which I've forgotten who it is who says to the main character, to Yuri Zhivago, the personal life is dead. The personal life had been dead in the Soviet Union. There had been something called the collective life, the life of the kind of the mass rather than the individual. And that attempt at totalizing consciousness led to a certain to an inability to write about individual personal feelings and personal stories. So as they got over that, they began to respond to other parts of the world beyond their borders that was suddenly kind of roaring into their experience in their lives. They fell in love with rock music. What I remember was when I was there in the 90s, that it felt to me like very much like the 60s. There was a sense of new freedom in the air. It was a sense of love abloom. There was people were expressing affection openly. It was just sort of a radical shift. And that radical shift in individual freedom and behavior was reflected in the literature. There was another element too, because at the same time, the Soviet sort of invasion of Afghanistan had just wound down, and a number of the writers had served in the military and were returning with their own kind of war stories to tell, all too familiar to us here.
I mentioned that you're a writer, and your latest work, I wanted you to maybe read an excerpt for us, Askold.
Certainly. So this is from the title story, The Man Who Would Not Bow. The Man Who Would Not Bow is about a Ukrainian revolutionary who begins as a supporter of the Russian Revolution, whose own family had been coal miners in the eastern part of the country. And this person had seen his own father and mother um, die early deaths because of the kind of hard labor they had done in the coal mines. And as a result, he had joined revolutionary forces, believing in the ideals of a true people's republic. He gradually grew disillusioned with those ideals as he discovered that those who had assumed power were even more ruthless than those that they had deposed. And he is the man who would not bow. Instead of bowing to the forces that had risen up around him, he decided to resist and spend his life in resistance. He eventually becomes a refugee. But this is what I'm going to read you is a paragraph from that period when he suddenly discovers that what he had fought for as a young revolutionary was not what had come to pass. So this is from The Man Who Would Not Bow. The amount of blood spilled in the intervening decades astonished everyone. One of Mykola's brothers disappeared in the Siberian Gulag. Another was responsible for stripping farmers in the eastern region around Kirovohrad of their wheat, abetting a famine which led to millions of deaths. In some villages, cannibalism became common. The bodies of the lately dead were sliced up and placed on outdoor tables for sale like cuts of beef at a charcuterie. Mykola registered the losses in scars across his wrists, marking 2 suicide attempts. Both times, he himself changed his mind. He wasn't ready to give up. Then, in the spasm of a paragraph, he fell in love.
I wanted to hear more about what you're writing as you're watching what's going on in Ukraine, as well as what you're hearing and seeing. Askold Melnyczuk, my guest, professor at University of Massachusetts, Boston, reading from his latest work, The Man Who Would Not Bow. And I wanted to talk more also about some of the contemporary poets in Ukraine today. We'll continue talking with Askold after the break. You can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. You're listening to Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We're focused on Ukrainian writers today and what we can learn about Ukrainian culture and identity through them. My guest on Zoom, Askold Melnyczuk, a writer and professor at University of Massachusetts, Boston. Earlier, you read a poem from Oksana Zabushko, and I wanted you to maybe tell our listeners about another poet, Serhiy Zhadan.
Yeah, certainly. Serhiy Zhadan is a remarkable character. He's not only a poet, he's also a European rock star. His band, The Dogs, is hugely popular, not only in Ukraine, but throughout Europe. And in fact, his reputation precedes him, because I remember going to a reading at Harvard a couple of years ago when he was coming through town. And, usually poetry readings will bring in, a small number of people, 20, 30, 40, 50. Here in Boston, outside his country, somehow Zhadan's sort of reputation preceded him, and there were several hundred people packing the auditorium. He's again, by force of circumstance, certainly not something that had been his intention when he began, has become a powerful war poet. He is from the Donetsk, from the most besieged of the regions. In fact, he's from the part of the country where this war began in 2014. He's from the city of Kharkiv, which is now enduring perhaps the most sort of savage assault from Russian forces. That and Mariupol on the port and on the Black Sea are the most kind of assaulted cities at the moment. Zhadan is one of those poets who has refused to leave his home city. He's determined to not only remain there as a kind of inspiration for others, but to do practical things. By all accounts, he's still out on the streets, helping to bring people to bomb shelters and trying to rally their spirits, because that's part of what poetry does, after all, is inspirit us. The kind of courage of the poet is really kind of tapping into the sort of deeper subterranean sources of the courage of people in general and of their bottomless desire to be free and to stand up to power, to speak truth to it. So Jadon is also hugely prolific. He's a novelist. A new novel of his has just been published by Yale University Press, called The Orphanage. He published a book of poetry called The New Orthography, translated by John Hennessy and Ostap Keen. And last year, the American poet Major Jackson chose Jadon as a co-recipient, along with St. Lucian poet Canisia Lubrin, of the Derek Walcott Prize, which is sponsored by Arrowsmith Press and the Boston Playwrights Theater. And for those of your listeners who are not familiar with the work of Derek Walcott was really kind of one of the great English language poets of the 20th century. He was from St. Lucia, and he taught for many years at Boston University. Anyway, so Jadon was scheduled to come to Boston to read on May 15th. I fear that's not going to be likely now. And my hopes and prayers are with him as he remains in his city of Kharkiv. I've also heard that he's recently been nominated for the Nobel Prize, and may they be attending his work. His work speaks for itself.
I know you've provided us with a list to share with our listeners of book recommendations of Ukrainian writers and others. We're going to be sure to either tweet that out or put it up on our website, ctpublic.org/wherewelive. We know that writing can also be cathartic, and I had mentioned that I wanted to hear more about, what you're writing today. Have you gone back to poetry, or, what's going through your mind, Askold?
Yeah, well, I just finished a novel that had been about an American whistleblower who blows the whistle on a murder and winds up himself being imprisoned instead of having the killers imprisoned. And I was just beginning a new book when all this began. Right now, I'm only writing sort of short dispatches and responses to the war in Ukraine, and beginning to concentrate on translating work that is coming out from the country right now, and trying to find places for it. Because what's so very important for the people there is that they feel seen. The tragedy of the country, of its people, was that for much of the last century, they were invisible to the world. The Holodomor, the famine in the 1930s, happened while the New York Times correspondent Walter Duranty was based in Moscow, denying that anything was happening in Ukraine. There had been a journalist from the UK, Gareth Jones, who was, on the other hand, traveling through the country and reporting the famine, and stories about it were being published in England, but not in the US. So for writers, yes, the act of writing is itself cathartic, but it's the importance of it is the communication. It is the word getting out to others, and others attending to it, that is so central. There's another sort of superb poet that I want to mention, Lyuba Yakimchuk, whose book Apricots of Donbass was published this year by Lost Horse Press, and its translators are Oksana Maximchuk and Max Rosuchinsky, along with Svetlana Lavochkina. These are poems by another young poet who was displaced from the Donbass by a war that began in 2014, and was forced to move to Kyiv then. She has since then been doubly displaced and is now in Lviv, though I recently heard that she is planning to make a trip back to her native city, even under these most extreme and dangerous of circumstances. And again, Godspeed to her. So my work right now is focused for the foreseeable future on making sure that word about these writers gets out, that they are heard. We are hoping to have another hybrid event here in Boston on May 24th, sponsored by the Goethe Institute and the Brookline Booksmith, a superb bookstore in Brookline, Massachusetts, in which we will have a number of American writers, including Robert Pinsky, reading with Ukrainian writers zooming in live from wherever they happen to be. It'll be midnight for them, but they'll all be staying up in order to connect, so that we here can look into their eyes and let them know that we have seen them. Having seen them, how can we turn our backs on them? How can we allow this slow motion slaughter to continue to take place?
When you mentioned Jadon earlier being a war poet and the type of writing and literature we will see coming out of this crisis, Askold, I think you've said, when we think about war, it's not over for a couple of generations, and the ripple effects of that on families.
Absolutely. And that's, again, the kind of horror and of it all, that a war is not over when a peace treaty is signed. That's only the beginning of a healing process. We in this country know this all too well. It's certainly arguable to say that the civil war in this country is not yet over, that all of its lessons have not been absorbed, and that the trauma of that war is passed on from generation to generation as people try to come to terms with both their kind of personal family histories and the complexity of perhaps having to recognize that what your own family had and a position it had taken had been wrong, coming to terms with the anger that comes from having been victimized for so long, so deliberately, with so much of the world witnessing this and not doing anything to stop it. So yeah, this is again the thing we most want to shed, that sense of frustration, anger, and horror that we might inherit from people for whom it is understandable because they had experienced it firsthand on their own bodies. But what they experienced at firsthand themselves, they unfortunately do pass on. There are, of course, ways to overcome it, and many people we know this again from our own war veterans. I worked with a number of veterans at UMass Boston, one of whom started a superb literary journal called Consequence, which focuses on the causes of war and its consequences across time.
And we'll have to leave it there. Askold Melnyczuk, a writer and professor at University of Massachusetts, Boston. What a pleasure to hear from you for the hour. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so very much, Lucy, for creating this opportunity. I'm deeply grateful to you and your listeners.
Today's show, produced by Tess Terrible. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We'll be back tomorrow.